My name is Naomi Crowfeather, and I became a park ranger for the same reason most people flee to Alaska, to escape something. In my case, it was the suffocating weight of expectations back home in Taos, where my grandmother wanted me to follow traditional paths and my college professors pushed me toward environmental law. The wilderness called to me in ways that courtrooms and ceremonial gatherings never could. Never could. When the posting came up for a remote ranger position at Kushtaka Lake Station in the Chugaki backcountry, 40 miles from the nearest road, I jumped at it. The job description was sparse. Maintain public use cabins, monitor wildlife, assist lost hikers, and radio weather reports twice daily. The pay was modest, but room and board were included. What sealed it was the final line. Applicant must be comfortable with extended periods of isolation. I packed my truck with everything I owned, which wasn't much, and drove the Alcan Highway through September's dying light. The hiring manager, a gruff man named Jenkins who looked like he'd been carved from driftwood, met me at the Seward Airport with a float plane barely larger than a grocery cart. "You sure about this, kid?" he asked, eyeing my slight frame. Last 3 Rangers didn't make it through a full season. Remote living ain't for everyone. I shouldered my pack and stepped onto the pontoon without answering. I'd grown up camping in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and my Pueblo heritage had taught me to read the land's moods. How different could Alaska be? The flight took 2 hours over increasingly wild terrain. Mountains thrust up from ancient forests like broken teeth, their peaks already dusted with early snow. Below us, rivers carved silver lines through valleys that looked untouched since the Ice Age. As we descended toward Kushtaka Lake, I caught my first glimpse of what would be home for the next 8 months. The lake stretched for miles, its surface black as obsidian. Dense spruce forest crowded the shoreline except for one small clearing, where a log cabin perched on a slight rise. A wooden dock extended into the water, and I could see solar panels glinting on the cabin's roof. It looked smaller than my college dorm room. "That's her," Jenkins shouted over the engine noise. Built in 1987. Propane for heat and cooking, solar for lights and radio. Generator backup. Nearest neighbor is the research station at Wolverine Bay, 30 miles south, but they're only staffed in summer. The plane touched down with a jarring bump, sending spray across the windscreen. As Jenkins taxied toward the dock, I studied my new domain. The forest pressed close on all sides, an impenetrable wall of green-black that seemed to absorb sound. The only breaks in the tree line were avalanche chutes scarring the distant mountainsides. Supply runs every 3 weeks, Jenkins continued as we tied off. Weather permitting. You've got a satellite phone for emergencies and a radio for daily check-ins. Medical kits in the cabin, along with a 36 for bear protection. Hope you know how to use it. I did. My grandfather had taught me to hunt deer in the high country, though I'd never shot anything larger than an elk. What about the previous rangers? Why didn't they stay? Jenkins was already unloading supplies, his movements quick and efficient. First one got homesick around Christmas. Second one had some kind of accident. Fell down the stairs, claimed something spooked him. Third one, Namaste, Kala. He paused, a box of canned goods halfway to the dock. Well, she reported some unusual wildlife activity, probably just bears getting ready for winter, but she got pretty worked up about it. Put in for transfer after 6 weeks. The cabin was rustic, but functional. One main room served as living area, kitchen, and office with a wood stove dominating the center. A narrow ladder led to a sleeping loft. The bathroom was an outhouse 50 yards away, connected by a well-worn path. All the windows faced the lake except for one small one in back that looked into the forest. It was covered by heavy curtains. Propane tanks are full. Generator serviced, radios on channel 16, daily check-ins at 0800 and 2000 hours. Missed 2 in a row, and we send someone to check on you. He handed me a thick folder. Trail maps, emergency procedures, cabin maintenance schedule. Hoorah. The public use cabins are marked in red. You'll need to check them weekly, make sure they're stocked and clean. Mostly they're empty this time of year, but you get the occasional hunter or photographer. After Jenkins left, the silence settled over me like a physical weight. True. I'd expected quiet, but this was something else entirely, an absence of sound so complete it made my ears ring. Even the lake was still, its surface unbroken by fish or waterfowl. I spent the rest of the day getting oriented. The cabin was well equipped with supplies to last months: canned food, dried goods, medical supplies, tools, and a small library of field guides and classic novels. The rifle hung above the door, a bolt-action Remington that looked well maintained. A box of ammunition sat on the shelf below it. The daily routine Jenkins had outlined was straightforward. Morning radio check, weather observation, cabin inspection rounds twice weekly, trail maintenance as needed, and evening radio contact. The nearest public use cabin was 3 miles up the North Trail, another at 5 miles south along the lakeshore. A third cabin sat at the far end of the lake, accessible only by boat or a grueling 8-mile hike. That first night, I sat on the cabin's front porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The lake reflected the sky like a mirror, creating the illusion that I was suspended between two worlds. As darkness fell, the silence deepened. No coyotes, no owls, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, just the occasional pop of the cabin settling and the distant crack of ice forming in shadowed valleys. I was reading by lamplight when the first sound came, a low, warbling call from somewhere across the lake. It was unlike anything I'd heard before, too deep for a wolf, too sustained for a bear. It seemed to roll across the water and echo off the mountains before fading into silence. I stepped onto the porch and listened, but the sound didn't repeat. Probably just a loon, I told myself, though it hadn't sounded like any loon I knew. Alaska was full of unfamiliar wildlife. I'd learn their voices soon enough. The next morning brought my first radio check with the outside world. The base station crackled to life at exactly 8 o'clock. 8 o'clock. Kushtaka Station, this is Chugach Base, come in. Chugach Base, this is Kushtaka Station, all good here. Weather is clear, temperature 38 degrees, light wind from the northwest. Copy that, Kushtaka. How are you settling in? Planning to hike the North Trail today, check the first cabin. Sounds good. Remember to file your route plan before any backcountry travel. Chugach Base out. I loaded my pack with repair supplies and headed out. The trail was well maintained but narrow, winding through dense spruce forest where the canopy blocked most of the sky. Old blazes marked the route, some so weathered they were barely visible. The forest floor was spongy with decades of fallen needles, muffling my footsteps. The first cabin appeared after an hour of steady hiking. It was smaller than the ranger station, just one room with 4 bunks, a wood stove, and basic supplies. Everything was in order: firewood stacked, water containers full, emergency food sealed in bear-proof containers. I checked the guest register and found the last entry dated 3 weeks ago. Great fishing at the beaver ponds. Thanks for maintaining this place. Bob and Linda Carson, Anchorage. The return hike felt different. Maybe it was the way the shadows fell or how the wind had picked up, setting the trees to creaking and swaying. Twice I stopped, certain I'd heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned, the trail was empty. The trail was empty. The forest felt heavier somehow, as if the trees were leaning in to watch. Back at the station, I radioed my return and settled in for the evening. The sun was setting earlier each day, and by 6 o'clock, the cabin was surrounded by darkness. I just finished dinner when I heard it again. That same warbling call, closer this time, coming from the forest behind the cabin. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The beam barely penetrated the tree line, creating a wall of black beyond its reach. The call came again, definitely from the forest, and this time it was answered by another voice from the far side of the clearing. The two calls overlapped, creating an eerie harmony that made the hair on my arms stand up. Wolves, I decided. It had to be wolves. But when I mentioned it during my evening radio check, the dispatcher sounded puzzled. That's unusual. We don't get many wolves in that area. Mostly black bears and the occasional brown bear. Could have been loons. They can make some strange sounds during migration. Maybe, I said, though I'd grown up near lakes and knew every sound a loon could make. This was something else. That night, I lay in the loft listening to the silence. No more calls came, but something was moving outside. I could hear it circling the cabin, heavy footsteps that paused at each window before moving on. Bears investigating the new occupant, probably. Normal behavior. Nothing to worry about. But when I finally drifted off to sleep, I kept the rifle within arm's reach. The tracks appeared on my 5th morning at Kushtaka Lake. I discovered them while checking the generator, massive impressions in the soft earth behind the cabin where the previous night's visitor had walked. At first glance, they looked human. 5 toes, an arch, a heel, but they were enormous, nearly 18 inches long and proportionally wide, pressed deep into the soil as if made by something weighing hundreds of pounds. I knelt beside the clearest print, using my own boot for scale. The impression was perfect, showing individual toe marks and what looked like the texture of skin. Whatever had made it had been walking upright, taking steps longer than any human could manage. The stride length was close to 6 feet. Bear tracks, I told myself. Had to be. Large brown bears could leave prints that resembled human feet, especially in soft ground, but these were too detailed, too perfectly formed. And I'd never heard of a bear walking consistently on its hind legs for the length of track I was following. The trail circled the cabin completely, passing close to every window. At the back corner, the creature had stopped and pressed close to the building. Scratches marked the log walls at a height of nearly 8 feet, too high for any bear I knew of. I photographed everything with the station's digital camera, though I wasn't sure who I'd show the pictures to. Jenkins would probably write them off as bear sign, and I was beginning to think that might be the healthiest response. Remote living could play tricks on your mind. Every ranger manual warned about isolation psychosis, how the brain started creating patterns and threats where none existed. The weather was turning. Heavy clouds had moved in overnight, bringing the first serious cold snap. Ice was forming along the lake's edges, and the mountains were disappearing into low-hanging fog. I spent the morning winterizing the station, checking the propane connections, testing the backup generator, inventorying emergency supplies. The afternoon's hike to the southern cabin felt different from the start. The forest was quiet in an oppressive way that made me constantly look over my shoulder. Animals went silent when predators were near. I knew that much, but what kind of predator could silence an entire forest? The southern cabin sat in a small meadow where a beaver dam had created a series of ponds. Usually such places were alive with birds and small mammals, but today the area felt abandoned. Even the beaver lodge appeared empty, no fresh cuttings on the surrounding aspens. Inside the cabin, I found the first real sign that something was wrong. The guest register's last entry was dated just 4 days ago, but it was incomplete. October 12, Mike Petrov, photographer from Anchorage. Something wrong here. The sounds at night, the smell, found huge tracks by the water. This place is... The entry stopped mid-sentence, the pen trailing off as if the writer had been interrupted. The rest of the page was blank. I checked the cabin thoroughly. No signs of struggle, no blood, no indication of what might have happened to Mike Petrov. His gear was gone, but that could mean he'd simply packed up and left. The emergency radio was dead, its batteries corroded in their housing. Outside, I searched the area around the cabin. The ground was harder here, mostly rock and frozen earth. But I found them eventually. The same massive tracks leading from the cabin toward the forest. Near the tree line, I discovered something that made my stomach clench. A torn piece of fabric, dark blue and heavy, caught on a low branch about 7 feet off the ground. The fabric looked fresh, not weathered by rain or sun. I bagged it as evidence, though evidence of what, I couldn't say. The hike back to the station felt like a retreat. Twice I stopped and called out, announcing my presence to any wildlife in the area. "Hey bear, coming through." It was standard protocol in bear country, but my voice sounded thin and ineffective in the vast silence. That evening's radio check was strained. I reported the missing photographer but left out the details about the tracks and the incomplete journal entry. Those things felt too strange to communicate over an open channel. "We'll look into the Petrov situation," the dispatcher promised. The dispatcher promised. Probably just left early and forgot to finish his entry. Happens all the time. "What about evacuation procedures?" I asked. "If weather gets bad or there's an emergency." "Why? You having problems out there?" I looked out the window at the darkening forest. "Just want to know my options." Emergency pickup can take anywhere from 6 hours to 3 days, depending on weather. Helicopter if conditions allow, otherwise we'd have to bring a snow machine in once the lake freezes. "Why? You're not going soft on us already, are you?" Just being prepared. But as I signed off, I was already considering my options. The lake wouldn't freeze solid for another month at least, and a helicopter couldn't land in heavy weather. If something happened, I'd be on my own for days. That night, the sounds returned. Not the warbling calls of the first few days, but something worse, a low moaning that seemed to come from right outside the cabin walls. It would start at one corner and move slowly around the building, pausing at each window like before. I lay in the loft with the rifle across my chest, listening to the deliberate circuit. Whatever was making those sounds was intelligent enough to be investigating, systematic enough to check every potential entry point. When it reached the back window, the one that stayed curtained, it stopped for a long time. I heard scratching against the glass, then a sound like sniffing or heavy breathing. The next morning brought fresh snow and more tracks. This time they led right up to the front door, where deep gouges marked the wood. Something had tested the door's strength, scratching at the frame as if gauging how difficult it would be to tear the barrier away. I spent that day reinforcing the cabin's defenses, though I told myself I was just following winter preparation protocols. I moved the emergency supplies to the loft and checked the satellite phone's battery level. The signal was weak but functional. When the scratching came again that night, I was ready. I crept to the back window and slowly pulled the curtain aside, flashlight in one hand, rifle in the other. Two eyes reflected the beam back at me from a height of nearly 9 feet. They were intelligent eyes, undeniably aware, studying me as intently as I was studying them. For a moment, we simply looked at each other through the glass. Then the creature stepped back into the forest, and I caught a glimpse of its full form. It walked upright like a man, but was covered in dark, shaggy hair. Its shoulders were massively broad, its arms hanging almost to its knees. The face was more human than animal, with a pronounced brow ridge and what looked like a beard of coarse hair. When it turned away, I estimated its height at close to 10 feet. I stumbled backward from the window, my heart hammering. The rifle shook in my hands as I tried to process what I'd seen. This was no bear, no case of mistaken identity or isolation psychosis. This was something else entirely. The radio crackled to life with the evening check-in, making me jump. "Kushtaka Station, this is Chugach Base, come in." My voice barely worked. "Chugach Base, Kushtaka Station. All faithful. All good here. Copy that. Weather report shows heavy snow moving in tomorrow. You should have enough supplies to ride it out. Copy. Question: have there been any reports of unusual wildlife in this area? Large predators?" A pause. "What kind of unusual wildlife?" I stared at the curtain window, wondering if those eyes were still watching. Never mind. Probably just a big brown bear. Kushtaka Station out. But I knew what I'd seen, and it wasn't any bear. As I loaded fresh cartridges into the rifle and checked the locks on the doors, one word kept echoing in my mind. A word from my grandmother's stories about the old times when the boundary between the human and spirit worlds was thin. Kushtaka. The Tlingit name for the creature that lived in the deep forests, the hairy man who watched from the shadows and sometimes took people who wandered too far from the safety of their villages. I thought it was just folklore. Now alone in the wilderness with something intelligent circling my cabin, I wasn't so sure. The blizzard hit on my 10th day at Kushtaka Lake, bringing with it a isolation so complete it felt like being buried alive. Buried alive. For 3 days, snow fell without stopping, piling 6 feet deep around the cabin and cutting visibility to mere yards. The wind howled through the forest with such force that the cabin's walls creaked and groaned like a ship in a storm. I couldn't make radio contact. The storm was disrupting all communications, leaving me truly alone for the first time since arriving. The satellite phone showed no signal bars, and the emergency beacon's test light flickered weakly before dying entirely. On the 3rd night of the storm, when the wind finally began to die down, I heard them, voices in the snow. At first I thought it was the wind playing tricks, the way it could sound like human speech when it caught in the trees just right. But these voices were too clear, too organized. They moved around the cabin in a pattern, calling to each other in a language I didn't recognize. The voices weren't human. They were deep and resonant, with a guttural quality that made them sound like they were coming from throats not designed for speech. Sometimes they seemed to be discussing something, with longer exchanges that had the rhythm of conversation. Other times, they called out in what sounded like signals or warnings. I pressed myself against the floor of the loft, afraid to make any sound that might draw their attention to the cabin's interior. The voices continued for hours, circling, pausing, moving on. Occasionally, one would approach the building directly, and I'd hear heavy footsteps on the covered porch or the scrape of something large against the walls. When dawn finally came, the storm was over, but the world outside had been transformed. The forest was buried under pristine snow, and the lake had begun to freeze in earnest. The cabin looked like a small island in an ocean of white connected to the world only by the smoke rising from its chimney. I dug out the front door and immediately found them, dozens of tracks in the fresh snow. They led in all directions, forming a complex pattern around the cabin that looked almost ritualistic. Some were the massive prints I'd seen before, but others were smaller, suggesting a group of different-sized individuals, a family, perhaps. But it was what I found by the woodshed that made my blood turn cold. Hanging from a low branch was the carcass of a caribou, field-dressed and partially eaten. The cuts were clean and precise, made with tools rather than teeth or claws. Someone, or something, was leaving me a gift. I photographed everything, knowing the images might be the only proof of what was happening. The tracks, the positioned carcass, the clear evidence of intelligence behind it all. This wasn't random animal behavior. This was communication. That afternoon, I managed to restore radio contact. The base station was relieved to hear from me. Kushtaka Station, we were starting to get worried. How did you weather the storm? Fine. No damage to the station. I have something to report, though. There's been unusual animal activity. Large predators, possibly a family group, bears. I hesitated. How could I explain what I was really seeing? They're exhibiting unusual behavior, very intelligent, possibly dangerous. They've been circling the station, leaving offerings. The dispatcher's voice carried a note of concern. What kind of offerings? Fresh killed game, positioned deliberately. And the tracks, I stopped myself. This was sounding more unhinged by the moment. Look, it's normal for bears to show curiosity about human habitation, especially before denning. They're probably just investigating food sources. As long as they're not trying to break in, I wouldn't worry too much. These aren't bears. A long pause. What do you think they are? I stared out at the forest where I could see movement in the shadows between the trees. I don't know, but they're watching me all the time. And they're intelligent. Nayeli, you've been isolated for 10 days in harsh conditions. Sometimes the mind can play tricks. I know what I'm seeing. My voice was sharper than I intended. These things are real and they're getting bolder. Another pause. Do you want to request evacuation? Did I? The smart thing would be to get out while I still could. But something stopped me, partly professional pride, partly a growing sense that whatever was happening here needed to be understood, not fled from. Not yet. But I wanted on record that there's unknown wildlife activity at this location. If something happens to me, people should know what they're dealing with. Understood. We'll file a report. But Nenali, if you feel threatened at any time, use the emergency beacon. We'll get someone to you as soon as possible. That evening, I prepared for another visit. I loaded the rifle and set up a camera by the back window, hoping to get clear footage. If these creatures were as intelligent as they seemed, maybe showing that I was documenting them would change their behavior. They came just after midnight, emerging from the forest like shadows given form. In the clear moonlight on snow, I could see them clearly for the first time. There were 4 of them, 2 large adults and 2 smaller individuals, possibly juveniles. They moved with purpose, communicating in their deep guttural language as they approached the cabin. The book described them as neither fully human nor animal, existing in the spaces between worlds. They could mimic human speech and behavior when necessary, but their true nature was something altogether alien. Most disturbing of all, those taken by the Kushtaka were said to change, becoming something neither human nor spirit, forever caught between 2 realities. I'd also found references to their territorial behavior. They didn't usually reveal themselves to humans unless something had disturbed their domain. The fact that they were making contact suggested that my presence at the lake was more significant than I'd realized. The day had been deceptively peaceful. I'd made my routine radio checks, filed weather reports, and even managed to reach the northern cabin for a supply check. Everything seemed normal, but I felt their presence constantly now, a weight of observation that never lifted. As evening approached, I prepared differently than before. Instead of defensive measures, I laid out offerings of my own. Canned food, warm clothing, even some of my grandmother's turquoise jewelry. If they wanted to make contact, I would try to establish peaceful relations. But when they emerged from the forest that night, I knew immediately that something had changed. There were more of them, at least 8 that I could see, possibly more lurking in the tree line. Their movements were more aggressive, less patient than before. The largest one, my frequent visitor, no longer approached the door. Instead, they spread out around the cabin in a tight perimeter. The vocalizations were different too, sharper, more urgent. They weren't trying to communicate anymore. They were coordinating an operation. I grabbed the rifle and retreated to the loft, but before I could reach the ladder, the lights went out. The generator had been shut off, probably deliberately. These creatures understood human technology well enough to disable it. In the darkness, I heard them testing the cabin's defenses. The scratching at the windows was more forceful now, and something heavy was pressing against the front door. The logs groaned under the pressure, and I realized with growing panic that the barriers I'd trusted to keep me safe wouldn't hold for long. Then I heard the most terrifying sound of all, the squeal of rusty hinges. The storm cellar door, which I'd never bothered to secure properly, was being opened from the outside. I'd forgotten about the cellar entirely. A small storage space beneath the cabin accessible through an exterior door I'd assumed was too small for anything large to use. But as heavy footsteps echoed from below, I realized I'd made a fatal mistake. The floorboards creaked as something moved through the cellar directly beneath me. There was an access hatch to the main floor, hidden under a rug in the corner. I'd noticed it during my initial inspection, but hadn't thought it significant. I moved toward the rifle, but it was too late. The hatch opened with a bang, and a massive arm reached through, followed by a head and shoulders. The creature pulled itself up through the opening with fluid grace, unfolding to its full height in the cabin's main room. In the moonlight streaming through the windows, I could see it clearly. It stood nearly 10 feet tall, covered in coarse, dark hair that seemed to absorb light. Its face was a disturbing blend of human and animal features. Intelligent eyes set in a heavy brow, a nose that was almost human but too broad, and a mouth full of teeth designed for more than just vegetation. It looked up at me in the loft and spoke, its voice a deep rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Naily. My name. It knew my name. I raised the rifle, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep it steady. Stay back. I'm armed. The creature tilted its head, studying the weapon with what looked like amusement. Your weapons cannot harm us. We are between worlds. You know this. It was right, and somehow I did know it. The bullets in that rifle were meant for bears and wolves, creatures of flesh and bone. These beings existed partly in the spirit realm, where conventional weapons had no power. What do you want? I managed to ask. You have seen us. You know our secret. This cannot be undone. It stepped closer to the ladder, moving with surprising gentleness for something so large. But you are not like the others who come here. You hear the old stories. Your blood remembers the time before the separation. My grandmother's words echoed in my memory. The old ways are still there, granddaughter. In the wild places, the boundary between worlds grows thin. I won't tell anyone, I said desperately. I'll leave, transfer to another station. No one has to know. Knowledge changes the knower, the creature replied. You cannot unknow what you have learned, and we cannot risk exposure. Our survival depends on remaining hidden. Another of the creatures appeared at the window and then another at the door. They weren't breaking in anymore. They were simply entering, passing through barriers as if they didn't exist. The cabin filled with their presence, huge forms that somehow fit in the small space despite their size. But you are offered a choice, the first one continued. Come willingly and join us in the deep forest. Become a guardian of the threshold between worlds. Or what? Its expression grew sad, almost regretful. Or we ensure your silence in other ways. I understood then what had happened to the previous rangers, to the photographer who'd never finished his journal entry. Some had been given the choice and refused. Others had been deemed too dangerous to let go. But there was something else in the creature's manner, a hesitation that suggested this wasn't the outcome it preferred. These beings weren't monsters. They were survivors, protecting themselves in their domain from a world that would hunt them to extinction if it knew they existed. If I come with you, I said slowly, what happens to me? You become something new. Not human, not Kushtaka, but a bridge between both. You would guard this place, help maintain the boundary. Others like you have made this choice before. Others? The one you called Jenkins. Inten. The ranger from 2 seasons past, the photographer from the southern cabin, when we offered him the choice instead of, it gestured vaguely. My mind reeled. Jenkins, my supervisor, was one of them, or had been human once. It explained his strange reactions to my questions, his reluctance to discuss the previous rangers. You're asking me to give up my humanity. We're asking you to expand it, to become part of something larger and older than the world your people have built. I looked around at the assembled creatures, seeing them with new eyes. They weren't invaders or monsters. They were the original inhabitants of this place, older than the forests, older than the mountains themselves. And I was the intruder, but I was also being offered membership in something that transcended the ordinary world. A chance to be part of the mystery instead of its victim. The largest creature extended a massive hairy hand toward me. Choose Naily Crowfeather. But choose now. Eily Crowfeather. Dawn comes, and with it, the window of opportunity closes. I looked at the rifle in my hands, then at the radio equipment that could call for help. Both seemed suddenly insignificant, tools from a world that had no power here. Then I looked at the creature's eyes and saw something I hadn't expected. Hope. They wanted me to choose to come willingly, to join them rather than forcing the issue. There was honor in that, a respect for choice that spoke to their fundamental nature. My grandmother had always said that the most important decisions came not from the head, but from the heart, from the place where intuition lived. And my intuition was telling me that this moment would define not just my fate, but my very essence. I set down the rifle and climbed down from the loft. The transformation didn't happen all at once. When I took the creature's hand, I expected immediate change, pain perhaps, or a sudden shifting of my physical form. Instead, there was only warmth and a strange sense of coming home to a place I'd never been. They led me out into the forest, moving through the snow without leaving tracks. I found I could do the same, my feet somehow finding purchase on air when necessary, my body becoming lighter and more fluid with each step away from the cabin. The night forest that had seemed so threatening now felt welcoming, alive with currents of energy I was only beginning to perceive. We traveled for hours through landscapes that shouldn't have existed. Valleys that hadn't been on any map, streams that flowed uphill when viewed from certain angles, groves of trees that hummed with ancient songs. The boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds grew increasingly thin until I could no longer tell which reality I was inhabiting. The creature who had first spoken to me, who told me his name was Yagi, the keeper of thresholds, explained the process as we walked. Your kind sees the world as solid, fixed, he said in his deep, resonant voice. But everything flows, everything changes. We exist in the spaces between your certainties, in the moments when belief wavers and possibility opens. I found I could understand not just his words, but the emotions behind them, the loneliness of his species scattered and hidden across the vast wilderness. The weight of being guardians of secrets too dangerous for the modern world to know, the constant vigilance required to maintain the barriers between human civilization and the older powers that still moved through the deep places. Why me? I asked as we paused beside a lake that reflected stars I'd never seen before. Because you carry the old blood, replied another of the creatures, an ancient female whose white-streaked fur marked her as an elder. Your grandmother's people knew of us once, traded with us, helped maintain the balance. That knowledge sleeps in you, but it never died. It was true. As the night progressed, memories that weren't entirely my own began to surface. Images of my ancestors meeting with tall, hairy figures at the edges of sacred spaces. Treaties made not with words but with rituals that bound both species to mutual protection. Stories that had been dismissed as folklore but contained literal truth. The ranger before me, I said. You said he made the same choice. Yegi nodded. Marcus chose transformation 3 years ago. He watches the Southern Territory now, ensures that those who venture too deep either turn back or join us. He was struggling with the decision when you saw him at the northern cabin. Marcus, the photographer who'd never finished his journal entry. He'd been given the choice and taken time to consider it, leaving the cabin before the transformation was complete. But he'd returned eventually, accepting what he was becoming. And Jenkins? Much older. He chose us in 1987, when the station was first built. He returns to the human world periodically to ensure the right people are sent to this place. Those who might understand, who might be offered the choice. I thought about Jenkins' careful selection of rangers, his pointed questions about my comfort with isolation. He'd been evaluating me from the beginning, looking for signs that I might be compatible with this life. As dawn approached, we reached their settlement. Though settlement wasn't quite the right word. It was more like a convergence of energies, a place where the forest itself had awakened to consciousness. Structures that might have been buildings or might have been living trees provided shelter, while streams of impossible colors carried water that tasted of starlight. Other beings lived here, not all of them recognizable as the same species I'd encountered. Some were smaller, more human-looking. Others were vast and tree-like, barely distinguishable from the forest around them. All of them acknowledged me with a mixture of curiosity and welcome. This is your choice, Yegi said as we stood at the edge of their community. Cross this threshold and you become one of us forever. Your human life ends, but something greater begins. Or walk away now, and we will ensure you remember this as only a dream. I looked back toward where I'd come from, though the human world was no longer visible through the veils between realities. Everything I'd known, everyone I'd cared about, my education, my plans, my identity as a park ranger, all of it would be left behind. But I would also be leaving behind the loneliness that had driven me to this remote posting in the first place. The sense of never quite fitting in either the modern world or the traditional one my grandmother represented. Here in this place between places, I could be something new. What would I become? I asked. A guardian, the elder female replied. A watcher at the thresholds. You would help maintain the boundaries that keep both our worlds safe. When humans venture too deep into the wild places, you would guide them back. When our people need to interact with your world, you would facilitate that contact. And if others like me come to the station, you would evaluate them as Jenkins evaluated you. Some would be turned away. Others might be offered the choice you face now. I thought about the responsibility of that, the weight of deciding who might be ready for such a transformation. It was not a power to be taken lightly. Will I still be me? Yagi smiled, an expression that was both alien and perfectly familiar. You will be more yourself than you have ever been. The parts of you that never fit in either world will finally have a place to flourish. As I stood there, poised between two realities, I felt something shift inside me. The constant restlessness that had driven me north, the sense of searching for something I couldn't name. It was finally coming to an end. I stepped across the threshold. The change was immediate and profound. My body elongated, hair sprouting across my skin as my features shifted to accommodate a new reality. But the transformation was more than physical. My consciousness expanded to encompass awareness of both worlds simultaneously. Yeah, I could feel the boundaries between them, understand how they connected and where they diverged. Most importantly, I could feel the web of guardians that stretched across the wilderness. Others like me who had made the same choice. Watchers who ensured that the modern world remained unaware of the ancient powers that still moved through the wild places. Jenkins contacted me 3 days later through means that had nothing to do with radio waves. He appeared at the edge of the settlement, looking exactly as he had when I'd first met him, though I could now see the truth of what he was. How do you feel? He asked. Complete, I said, surprised by how accurate the word was. Like I've finally found where I belong. He nodded. The station needs a new ranger, someone who understands the real requirements of the position. Oh, what about my family? People will ask questions. We've handled that. As far as the outside world knows, you completed your contract and took a position with a research station in the Brooks Range. Remote enough that communication is limited. I thought about my grandmother, who had always insisted that the old ways were still alive in the wild places. Part of me wanted to tell her the truth, to share what I'd discovered. As the first gray light began to filter through the canopy, I finally understood why Morrison had requested that transfer. Some things in the wilderness weren't meant to be cataloged or understood. They were meant to be respected, feared, and avoided. But I was 26 years old, armed with modern equipment and scientific training. I convinced myself that fear was just my mind playing tricks. That isolation and unfamiliarity were creating phantoms where none existed. I was wrong, of course, but it would take another encounter to prove just how wrong I was. 3 days after my midnight encounter, the first hiker went missing. Jamie Redcrow, a 28-year-old photographer from Anchorage, had been documenting wildlife along the Northern Trail system. His girlfriend reported him overdue when he failed to return to their campsite at Beaver Creek, 15 miles from my station. I coordinated the search from the radio base while a team of volunteers spread out, along the established trails. Jamie's photography equipment was found scattered near Marker 17, expensive camera gear worth several $1,000s, abandoned without explanation. His backpack sat upright against a Douglas fir, completely undisturbed, containing food, water, and emergency supplies. But Jamie himself had vanished. The search pattern followed standard protocol. We worked outward from the last known location in expanding circles, calling his name and looking for any sign of passage through the underbrush. But after 6 hours, we had found nothing except those same strange claw marks I'd documented weeks earlier. Fresh ones this time, carved into trees along the exact route Jamie would have taken. As team leader, I was required to file incident reports with state authorities. The forms demanded explanations, theories about what might have happened. I wrote about disorientation, possible animal encounters, and the dangers of solo hiking in remote areas. But privately, I kept returning to the impossibility of the scene. No human being simply vanishes while leaving their survival gear behind, and no animal attack leaves equipment so precisely undisturbed. The search continued for 4 days. On the 3rd day, we found tracks. I was working the eastern grid with 2 volunteers when Martinez, a local hunting guide, called out from a game trail roughly half a mile from where Jamie's gear had been discovered. In a patch of soft earth beside a seasonal creek, a series of impressions led away from the established trail system and into the deepest part of the forest. The tracks were unlike anything in my field guides. Each print measured approximately 18 inches long and 8 inches wide, showing 5 distinct toe impressions. The depth of the impression suggested a creature weighing several hundred pounds, and the stride length measured nearly 6 feet between prints. But most disturbing was their clarity. These weren't the blurred or partial tracks usually found in wilderness settings. They were sharp, detailed, and impossibly fresh. Martinez refused to follow the trail. A man who had guided hunters through Alaska wilderness for 20 years, he took one look at those tracks and backed away as if they were radioactive. "I've seen grizzly tracks, black bear, even wolverine," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. This isn't any animal that's supposed to exist. I photographed the prints from multiple angles, took detailed measurements, and made plaster casts using supplies from the emergency kit. Name it. The documentation would be valuable for wildlife authorities, I told myself, though I already knew no official report would ever acknowledge what we had found. The trail led deep into old-growth forest where the canopy was so thick that midday felt like twilight. Massive spruce and hemlock trees, some over 300 years old, created cathedral-like spaces between their trunks. The forest floor was covered in a thick carpet of needles that muffled sound and made walking feel like moving through a dream. I followed the tracks alone, despite protocol requiring partner systems for deep forest investigation. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but the possibility of finding Jamie alive drove me forward. The trail was easy to follow. Whatever had made these prints wasn't trying to hide its passage. Broken branches marked its route, and occasionally I found tufts of coarse, dark hair caught on bark at heights no human could reach. After 2 hours of tracking, the trail led to a clearing I had never seen on any topographical map. It was perfectly circular, roughly 50 yards across, and completely devoid of vegetation. The earth was packed hard as concrete, as if something massive had been moving in circles for years, wearing away any plant life that tried to establish itself. At the center of the clearing sat a pile of objects that made my stomach lurch with recognition. Backpacks, hiking boots, cameras, water bottles, the accumulated belongings of people who had walked into this forest and never walked out. I counted items from at least 12 different individuals, arranged in a careful spiral pattern that spoke of intelligence and intention. Jamie's day pack sat at the very top of the pile, as fresh as if it had been placed there minutes before my arrival. The logical part of my mind tried to process what I was seeing in terms of known phenomena. Bears sometimes collected objects, though never with such organization. Human predators might create trophy collections, though the remote location made that explanation unlikely. But even as I cataloged rational possibilities, I knew I was looking at something beyond normal categories of understanding. I was photographing the scene when I heard the sound that had haunted my nights. That low, rumbling vocalization that seemed to come from deep within the forest. Croak. But this time it was answered. From 3 different directions, similar calls echoed through the trees, creating a triangulation pattern with the clearing at its center. They were coordinating, communicating, hunting. I ran. Years of physical training had prepared me for emergency evacuations, but nothing had prepared me for the sheer terror of fleeing through dense forest while something massive crashed through the undergrowth behind me. Branches whipped across my face, roots caught my boots, and twice I stumbled hard enough to scrape skin from my palms and knees. The pursuit lasted exactly 11 minutes. I timed it later, compulsively, trying to understand the parameters of my survival. The sounds of pursuit stopped as abruptly as they had begun, right at the edge of the established trail system. Whatever was chasing me had rules, boundaries it wouldn't cross, boundaries it would. The realization was almost as terrifying as the chase itself because it suggested planning and restraint that no wild animal possessed. I made it back to the station as darkness fell, my uniform torn and my hands shaking so badly I could barely operate the radio. The search for Jamie was officially called off the next morning, listed as a presumed accidental death in wilderness conditions. His belongings would never be recovered, according to my report, lost somewhere in the vast, trackless forest. But I knew exactly where they were, arranged in that spiral pattern with the others, waiting for the next addition to the collection. That night, as I sat in my cabin cleaning my wounds and trying to make sense of what I had witnessed, I finally understood Morrison's fear. This wasn't about protecting wilderness areas or helping lost hikers. This was about maintaining an ancient balance, respecting boundaries that had existed long before humans mapped this territory. The sounds outside my cabin began earlier that evening, around 9 p.m. instead of the usual 11. And for the first time, they weren't just circling. They were getting closer. The attacks on the station began 3 weeks after Jamie's disappearance. Small things at first. Equipment moved during the night, scratches on the radio antenna, deep gouges in the cabin's exterior walls. Each morning brought new evidence that something was testing our defenses, probing for weaknesses. I had reported the incidents to headquarters, requesting additional personnel and equipment upgrades. The response was predictably bureaucratic. Budget constraints, personnel shortages, and suggestions that I might benefit from stress leave and psychological evaluation. No one wanted to acknowledge that something in the Tongass forest was actively stalking their ranger station. Sleep became impossible. The nightly sounds grew more aggressive, more purposeful. Heavy footsteps circled the cabin for hours, accompanied by vocalizations that seemed almost conversational, as if multiple creatures were discussing strategy. Sometimes I caught glimpses of shapes moving past the windows, always at the edge of peripheral vision, never clear enough to photograph or properly identify. During daylight hours, I documented everything. Track measurements, hair samples, damage assessments, behavioral patterns, building a case file that no one would ever officially read. But the work gave me focus, a sense of purpose beyond simple survival. If I was going to share Jamie's fate, at least I could leave evidence for whoever found my remains. The breakthrough came during my 4th week of siege, when I discovered the pattern hidden in decades of missing person reports. Using the station's database and archived incident files, I cross-referenced disappearances with geographical locations, seasonal timing, and lunar cycles. What emerged was a hunting territory that stretched across nearly 200 square miles, with activity peaks corresponding to new moon phases and migration patterns of local wildlife. More disturbing was the timeline. The disappearances had been occurring for over 60 years, with gaps that corresponded to periods when the ranger station had been temporarily abandoned. Whatever was out there had learned to associate human presence with the station itself, treating it as both a boundary marker and a source of prey. Morrison hadn't just requested a transfer. He had been the latest in a long line of rangers who had discovered the truth and chosen to flee rather than fight. I was simply the first one foolish enough to stay and document the phenomenon. Quote, on a Thursday night in late October, they finally made their move. I was reviewing photographs at my desk when the power went out. The emergency lighting kicked in immediately, bathing the cabin in red emergency illumination that made everything look like a crime scene. Through the windows, I could see that the main station had also lost power. Something had disabled the entire electrical grid. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously. The front door exploded inward with a sound like a small bomb, while windows on both sides of the cabin shattered under impacts that left web patterns in the reinforced glass. Emergency protocols demanded that I retreat to the secure radio room and call for backup, but the hallway was blocked by a shape so large it had to duck to fit through the doorway. Up close, the creature was even more impossible than I had imagined. Standing nearly 9 feet tall, it was covered in coarse, dark hair that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its face was a disturbing hybrid of human and ape features, intelligent eyes set in a skull that was far too large for any primate I had studied. But the hands were the most unsettling feature. Elongated fingers ending in claws capable of the precision I had witnessed in that clearing, yet powerful enough to tear through reinforced doors. We stared at each other for perhaps 30 seconds, predator and prey frozen in mutual evaluation. Its breathing was slow and controlled, almost meditative, while mine came in ragged gasps that fogged the cold air. Intelligence shone in those dark eyes, not the simple cunning of a wild animal, but something approaching human awareness. Then it spoke. Not in words, but in a series of low vocalizations that conveyed meaning as clearly as any language. It was offering me a choice. Leave this territory and never return, or join the collection in the circular clearing. The communication was so direct, so unmistakably clear, that I found myself nodding in understanding. But acceptance came with a demonstration of power. The creature gestured toward the shattered windows, and I heard sounds of systematic destruction from the main station. Decades of communications equipment, whether monitoring instruments and emergency supplies, were being methodically dismantled by its companions. Everything that connected this remote outpost to the outside world was being eliminated. The message was clear. No rescue was coming, no backup would arrive, and no official response would acknowledge what had happened here. This was their territory, and they were taking it back. I spent that night huddled in the radio room, listening to the sounds of occupation. Heavy footsteps moved through the station, sorting through supplies and equipment with an intelligence that was somehow more terrifying than mindless destruction. They were evaluating, planning, deciding what had value and what could be discarded. By dawn, they were gone. The station was left in ruins, not the chaotic destruction of vandalism, but the precise dismantling of a structure that had outlived its usefulness. Every piece of communications equipment had been removed or destroyed. Emergency supplies were scattered but not stolen, as if to demonstrate that survival wasn't being made impossible, merely relocated. I packed what I could carry and began the 40-mile hike to the nearest highway. Behind me, the Tongass forest reclaimed what had always belonged to it, erasing the temporary human presence as if we had never existed. The official report blamed the destruction on a severe weather event, combined with electrical failures and structural damage from years of insufficient maintenance. No mention was made of the creatures that had occupied these mountains long before humans arrived to draw boundaries and establish stations. I never returned to Alaska. The nightmares followed me south, but they were manageable in cities surrounded by concrete and electric light. And electric light. Sometimes, usually during winter storms when the power goes out, I hear echoes of those vocalizations in the wind. And I remember the intelligence in those dark eyes, the patient way they had waited for me to understand my place in the ancient order of things. Ancient order of things. The Tongass Forest remains protected wilderness, though the ranger station at Lake Yeo was never rebuilt. Hikers still disappear occasionally, their belongings found arranged in careful patterns that investigators attribute to bear activity or equipment scavenging by other wildlife. But I know better. Somewhere in those dark trees, the collection continues to grow, tended by creatures whose only crime was defending their home against invaders who refuse to recognize the true boundaries of the wilderness. The forest remembers everything. And it never forgives those who forget their place in the natural order. This happened to me on October 23, 1997. At the time, I was just a few years into my role as a deputy sheriff in quiet, rural Redstone County, Montana. Country living suited me well. The endless mountain vistas, the clean air that cut through your lungs like a blade, the kind of silence that city folks never understand. Most nights, the radio crackled with nothing more exciting than Mrs. Henderson's reports of teenagers toilet papering her fence or Jake Morrison's monthly drunk and disorderly at the Coppermine Tavern. I thought I'd seen just about everything small town life could throw my way. Bar fights that ended with handshakes and apologies. Domestic disputes that dissolved once someone sobered up. The occasional tourist who'd gotten turned around on the mountain roads, low on gas and high on panic. Simple problems with simple solutions. Then came the night that changed everything. I was working the late shift, mostly dealing with the occasional drunk driver weaving his way home from the tavern or a domestic disturbance that would resolve itself by morning. The county stretched for hundreds of square miles, but the populated areas clustered near the valley floor, leaving vast expanses of Jefferson National Forest rolling away into darkness. On quiet nights like this, you could drive for an hour and see nothing but pine trees and the occasional set of deer eyes reflecting in your headlights. Things were slow, real slow. Maybe too slow, considering how eerily quiet the radio had been all evening. Handel, the kind of quiet that made you check your equipment twice, wondering if something had gone wrong with the dispatch system. I'd driven my usual patrol route, past the high school where kids like to park and drink, through the residential streets where porch lights cast yellow pools on cracked sidewalks, out to the truck stop where the overnight drivers grabbed coffee and complained about the mountain grades. Nothing. Not even a speeding ticket. A little past 1 a.m., the radio finally crackled to life with a burst of static that made me jump. A woman's voice came through, breathless and tinged with hysteria, barely understandable over the interference. The signal faded in and out like she was calling from the edge of the world. Sheriff's Department. Need help. My husband. Something in the woods. I grabbed the handset, my pulse quickening. Ma'am, this is Deputy Matthews. Can you repeat that? What's your location? More static. Her voice came through in fragments. Near our property. Attacked him. I can't find. Oh God, there's so much blood. Ma'am, I need you to stay calm and give me your address. What's your name? Evelyn Hartwell. 4847 Timber Ridge Road. Please hurry. I think Derek's dead. The line went silent except for the steady hiss of static. I tried raising her again, but got nothing. Timber Ridge Road. I knew it. Way out on the edge of the county, tucked up against the sprawling Jefferson National Forest. A dirt track that wound through miles of dense woods to reach a handful of isolated properties. The kind of place where your nearest neighbor might be 10 miles away and cell phone coverage was spotty at best. Protocol dictated partner backup for any potential violent crime scene. But everyone else was at least 30 minutes away, probably more, given the winding mountain roads. The way the woman's voice had trembled, every second could count. Derek might be bleeding out while I waited for backup that wouldn't arrive until it was too late. I made the decision to head out there alone. The drive to Timber Ridge Road took me deeper into the mountains than I'd been in months. The main highway curved through valleys where scattered ranch houses sat dark under the stars, then climbed into foothills thick with lodgepole, pine, and Douglas fir. My headlights swept across empty road, catching the occasional flash of reflective tape on a guardrail or road sign. The last stretch of road to the property was unpaved, barely more than a bumpy dirt track snaking deeper into the trees. My Crown Vic bounced and scraped over ruts and rocks, branches scraping against the windows like fingernails on glass. The trees pressed in on both sides, their trunks disappearing into black shadow beyond my headlight beams. I'd driven this road maybe twice in my 3 years with the department, both times for noise complaints that turned out to be nothing more than target practice or ATV riders.
Wow.
The isolation out here was complete. No streetlights, no houses visible through the trees, just the narrow tunnel of my headlights cutting through absolute darkness. Finally, I saw the house, a small, rundown, single-wide trailer bathed in the harsh glow of my cruiser's headlights. The front door hung wide open, swaying slightly in the mountain breeze. No lights were on inside. The windows stared back at me like dead eyes. I parked and cut the engine, immediately missing the comforting rumble of the Vate. Silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the insistent chirping of crickets and the soft tick of my cooling engine. The smell of pine sap and something else, something rank and wild that I couldn't quite identify, drifted through my open window. Something felt wrong. Every instinct I'd developed in 3 years of police work screamed at me to turn around, get the hell out of there, and wait for backup. But duty called, and I wasn't the type to ignore it. I grabbed my flashlight from the charger and checked my service weapon, a Glock 22 loaded with 15 rounds of .40 caliber ammunition. Standard department issue, enough to stop any human threat. At least, that's what I told myself as I stepped out of the cruiser. Freude. The mountain air hit me like a slap, cold and thin. October nights in Montana could drop into the 30s without warning, and my breath came out in small puffs of vapor. I moved toward the trailer cautiously, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, my other hand resting on the grip of my pistol. "Sheriff's Department?" I called out. "Mrs. Hartwell?" No response. The open door continued to sway in the breeze, hinges creaking softly. As I got closer to the trailer, that wild smell grew stronger. It reminded me of the time I'd found a dead elk that had been rotting in the sun for a week. Sweet decay mixed with something sharper, more predatory. Something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I reached the front steps and peered inside. My flashlight beam revealed a small living room that looked like a tornado had hit it. Furniture overturned, cushions slashed open, with stuffing scattered across the floor. Family photos lay shattered on the linoleum, glass crunching under my boots as I stepped inside. "Mrs. Hartwell, this is the Sheriff's Department. Are you hurt?" A sound from the back of the trailer made me freeze, a soft whimpering, like an injured animal. I followed the sound through a narrow hallway past a destroyed bedroom and into the small kitchen. The back door stood open, and through it I could see a figure huddled on the wooden steps. It was Evelyn Hartwell, and she was alive. She was alive. Evelyn sat hunched on the back porch steps, her arms wrapped around her knees, rocking back and forth in the pale spill of my flashlight. Her clothes were torn, not just ripped, but shredded as if by massive claws. Dark stains covered her blouse, and I could see angry red welts across her pale arms. "Ma'am?" I kept my voice soft as I approached. "Mrs. Hartwell, I'm Deputy Matthews. You called for help." She looked up at me with eyes that had seen something no one should ever see. They were wide and glassy, pupils dilated with shock. When she tried to speak, only a broken whisper came out. He's gone, she said. Derek's gone. I holstered my weapon and knelt beside her, pulling out my radio. Dispatch, this is Unit 7. I have a victim at 4847 Timber Ridge Road. I need EMS and backup, priority 1. Static answered me. I tried again with the same result. The mountains played hell with radio signals, and we were too far from the nearest repeater. Mrs. Hartwell, Evelyn, I need you to tell me what happened. Where's your husband? Between choked sobs and gasps, she told her story. Derek had been acting strange for weeks, she said. Distant and withdrawn, disappearing into the woods for hours at a time. He'd come back with wild stories about finding strange tracks, about hearing sounds that didn't belong to any animal he knew. Wednesday, she'd thought it was just cabin fever, the isolation getting to him like it got to a lot of folks who lived this far from town. That evening, it had escalated. Derek had flown into a rage, screaming incoherent accusations about things hiding in the forest, about something stalking their property. His eyes had been wild, unfocused, like he hadn't slept in days. He grabbed me, Evelyn whimpered, unconsciously rubbing at the bruises on her wrists, said he had to show me something, dragged me outside, toward the tree line. What did he want to show you? There was something out there. Something out there. In the woods. I saw it moving between the trees, just a shadow, but it was huge, bigger than any bear. Derek, he went in after it, said he was going to prove he wasn't crazy. She dissolved into tears, her body shaking uncontrollably, cracking uncontrollably. I put a hand on her shoulder, trying to offer what comfort I could while scanning the edge of the forest with my flashlight. The beam only penetrated maybe 30 feet into the trees before being swallowed by impenetrable darkness. Then I heard him scream. She continued. Not like a person screaming, like an animal caught in a trap. It went on, and then silence. How long ago was this? Maybe an hour. I tried to go after him, but I couldn't find him in the dark. I came back to call for help. I helped her to her feet, noting how she favored her left leg. Are you hurt? Do you need medical attention? She shook her head. Just scratched up from running through the brush. But Derek, we have to find Derek. I looked toward the tree line, where my flashlight beam disappeared into solid black. Every fiber of my being wanted to wait for backup, to call in a proper search and rescue team with dogs and proper equipment. But if Derek Hartwell was out there bleeding, every minute mattered. I need you to stay here, I told Evelyn. Lock the doors and don't come out until I get back. Can't go out there alone. You don't understand. That thing, it's not natural. Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but I'm trained for this. Your husband needs help. She grabbed my arm with surprising strength. It's still out there. I can feel it watching us. Despite myself, I found my eyes scanning the darkness beyond my flashlight beam. The forest stretched away in all directions, millions of acres of wilderness where anything could hide. For a moment, I thought I saw something move between the trees, a shifting of shadows that didn't match the sway of branches in the breeze, but when I focused my light on the spot, there was nothing there. Stay inside, I repeated, and started toward the forest. The disturbed earth was easy to follow at first. Derek's boots had left clear prints in the soft ground near the trailer, along with what looked like drag marks where he'd pulled his struggling wife. But as I moved into the trees, the trail became harder to read. The forest closed around me like a living thing. Pine boughs hung low overhead, blocking out the stars and creating a canopy so thick that my flashlight beam seemed to barely penetrate the gloom. The air grew thicker, heavy with the smell of pine sap and rotting vegetation. So, underneath it all, that wild animal scent I'd noticed earlier, musky and predatory. I'd been walking for maybe 10 minutes when I caught sight of something white against the dark ground. Derek's flannel shirt, torn and bloody, hanging from a low branch like a flag of surrender. I moved closer, playing my light over the fabric. 4 parallel tiers ran through the material, too long and too clean to have been made by any branch. Derek? Called out, my voice swallowed by the trees. Derek Hartwell, Sheriff's Department. No answer. But as I stood there listening, I became aware of how wrong the forest sounded. There were no night sounds, no owl calls, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, no buzz of insects. Even the crickets I'd heard near the trailer had gone silent. Tsehetset. The only sound was the whisper of wind through the pines and my own breathing. I followed the trail deeper into the woods, finding more evidence of Derek's passage. A broken branch here, a scuff mark in the earth there, and increasingly, signs that he hadn't been alone. Large depressions in the soft ground that might have been footprints, though unlike any I'd ever seen. They were huge, at least 18 inches long, with what looked like claw marks at the front. The trail led to a small clearing, maybe a quarter mile from the trailer. My flashlight beam swept across the open space and stopped on something that made my blood turn to ice. Derek Hartwell lay in the center of the clearing, his body twisted at an impossible angle. Blood soaked the ground around him, black in the harsh lead light. His clothes were shredded, his flesh torn open in long parallel gashes that went bone deep. But it was his face that would haunt my dreams for years to come. His eyes were wide open, staring up at the canopy in an expression of absolute terror. His mouth hung open in a silent scream, as if he'd died trying to warn someone of an approaching nightmare. I forced myself to move closer, fighting down the nausea that rose in my throat. I'd seen car accident victims, a few suicides, even a man who'd been mauled by a black bear. But nothing like this. The wounds were too precise, too systematic. Whatever had done this hadn't been acting out of hunger or fear. It had been methodical, almost surgical in its violence. I knelt beside the body, careful not to disturb the scene more than necessary. Derek had been dead for a while, at least 30 minutes, maybe more. His skin was already starting to cool in the mountain air. There was nothing I could do for him now. But as I crouched there, playing my flashlight over the carnage, I became aware of something else. The silence of the forest wasn't just absence of sound, it was presence, the feeling of being watched by something patient and intelligent. I stood slowly, my hand moving instinctively to my service weapon. The beam of my flashlight swept the edge of the clearing, probing the shadows between the trees, and that's when I saw them. 2 eyes reflecting the light like mirrors, floating about 8 feet off the ground at the far edge of the clearing. They watched me with an intelligence that was definitely not animal, definitely not human. The light caught them for just a moment before they disappeared, leaving me staring at empty forest. But I knew something was still there, still watching. "Evelyn," I whispered, backing away from Derek's body. I have to get back to Evelyn. The walk back through the forest felt like the longest journey of my life. Every shadow seemed to shift and move in my peripheral vision. Every branch that scraped against my jacket sounded like claws on fabric. I kept my flashlight beam moving constantly, sweeping back and forth across the trail, but the darkness beyond its reach felt alive with malevolent presence. Behind me, I could hear it following. Not footsteps exactly. The thing moved too quietly for that. But there were subtle sounds that had no business in a quiet forest. The soft crack of a branch under enormous weight. The whisper of something large moving through undergrowth. And once, when I stopped to catch my breath, I heard what sounded like breathing that wasn't quite human. I fought the urge to run. Running in dense forest with only a flashlight was a good way to break an ankle or slam face first into a tree. But more than that, some primitive part of my brain warned me that running would trigger a chase response. Whatever was back there was already hunting me. If I ran, it would pounce, so I walked. Steady, measured steps that carried me back toward the trailer and Evelyn. My right hand rested on the grip of my pistol, though I doubted 15 rounds of .6 .40 caliber would do much good against something that could tear a grown man apart like tissue paper. The trees began to thin as I approached the edge of the forest. Through the gaps between trunks, I could see the trailer and my patrol car sitting exactly where I'd left them. Yellow light spilled from the trailer's windows. Evelyn had managed to get the power back on. Or maybe it had never been off. From this distance, everything looked normal, peaceful even. But the thing behind me was getting closer. I could feel it now, a presence that raised every hair on my body. The air itself seemed to thicken with predatory intent. Whatever was stalking me through the darkness was deciding whether to attack or simply follow me back to its previous victim. I reached the edge of the trees and stepped into the small yard around the trailer. Immediately, the oppressive feeling lessened. Not gone. I could still sense eyes watching from the forest, but reduced to a manageable level of dread. "Evelyn?" I called out as I approached the front door. "It's Deputy Matthews. I'm coming in." No answer. The door stood slightly ajar, which wasn't how I'd left it. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. I pushed the door open with my foot, keeping my weapon drawn. "Evelyn, are you all right? Evelyn, are you all right?" The living room was empty, furniture still overturned from whatever had happened earlier. I moved through the trailer quickly, checking each room. Kitchen empty. Bedroom empty. The small bathroom at the end of the hall empty. But the back door was wide open, swaying in the breeze. I stepped out onto the back porch and played my flashlight across the small yard. There, at the edge of the tree line, I found her. Evelyn Hartwell stood perfectly still, her back to me, staring into the forest. "Evelyn?" I approached slowly, my weapon still drawn. Something about her posture seemed wrong. Too rigid, too unnatural. "Evelyn, we need to get out of here." She didn't respond. As I got closer, I could see that she was trembling, her whole body shaking like a leaf in a hurricane. Her hands hung at her sides, fingers splayed wide as if she was trying to grab onto something that wasn't there. "Evelyn, can you hear me?" Still no response. Moved around to face her, and what I saw made my blood freeze. Her eyes were wide open, pupils dilated to black pools, But she wasn't seeing me. She was staring at something beyond me, something in the forest that I couldn't see. Her mouth hung open slightly, and a thin line of drool ran down her chin. "Oh, Jesus," I whispered. She was catatonic, locked in some kind of traumatic dissociation that had left her mind completely detached from reality. And that's when I heard it behind me. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It vibrated through the ground under my feet, through the air around me, through my bones themselves. I spun around, bringing my flashlight up with my left hand and my pistol with my right. The creature stood at the edge of my light, just where the yellow lead beam began to fade into darkness. It was easily 8 feet tall, bipedal but wrong in every way that mattered. Its limbs were too long, ending in hands that looked more like bare paws with opposable thumbs. Its skin appeared smooth and dark, stretched tight over muscles that bulged and rippled with each breath. But it was the head that locked my knees and sent ice water through my veins. Wedge-shaped like a wolf's, but larger and more intelligent. The mouth was pulled back in a grotesque snarl that revealed rows of teeth, not the simple fangs of a predator, but something more complex, more purposeful. Teeth designed for more than just killing. And the eyes. Christ, the eyes. They reflected my flashlight beam like a cat's, but behind that shine was an intelligence that was alien and hostile and hungry. We stared at each other across 20 feet of mountain air, predator and prey sizing each other up. I could hear my own breathing, harsh and rapid. Kuza break. My hands shook so badly that the flashlight beam danced across the creature's massive form. This was no bear. No known animal. This was something else entirely, something that had no business existing in any rational world. "Easy," I whispered, as much to myself as to the thing watching me. "Easy now." The creature tilted its head slightly, and I had the horrible impression that it understood me. Not just the words, but the fear behind them. It was reading me the way a poker player reads tells, calculating my speed, my strength, my willingness to fight. I thumbed off the safety on my Glock, and brought it up in a standard two-handed grip. The tritium night sights glowed green in the darkness, centered on the creature's massive chest. "Stay back," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Don't come any closer." The thing made a sound that might have been amusement, a huffing exhalation that showed rows of gleaming teeth. Then it took a step forward. I fired. The muzzle flash lit up the forest for a split second, and the sharp crack of the .40 caliber round echoed off the trees. I saw the creature flinch as the bullet struck its shoulder, but it didn't go down. Didn't even stagger. Instead, it let out a roar that shook the windows of the trailer behind me. Not pain. Anger. I'd heard it, but not enough to stop it. And now it was pissed. It charged. Even expecting it, I wasn't prepared for the creature's speed. One moment it was 20 feet away. The next it was on top of me. I got off 2 more shots before its weight slammed into me like a freight train, sending both of us crashing to the ground. We rolled in the dirt and fallen leaves, the creature's claws raking across my chest and arms. My chest and arms. I managed to get my gun hand free and press the muzzle against its ribs, firing point blank. The creature shrieked and threw itself backward, giving me enough room to scramble to my feet. Blood ran down my arms from deep scratches, and my uniform shirt hung in tatters. Kudos. But I was alive, and I still had my weapon. The creature circled me now, staying just outside the range of my flashlight. I could see its eyes glowing in the darkness, along with what looked like a dark stain spreading across its shoulder where my first shot had connected. "Come on," I panted, trying to keep my voice steady. "Come on, you bastard." It feinted left, then right, testing my reactions. I tracked it with my pistol, trying to anticipate which direction it would attack from next, but it was too fast, too intelligent. It was learning my patterns, waiting for the right moment to strike. Behind me, I heard a soft whimper. Evelyn was still standing there, locked in her catatonic state, completely oblivious to the battle raging around her. The creature heard it too. Its head swiveled toward her, and I saw its lips pull back in what might have been anticipation. "No," I said, moving to put myself between them. "You want someone, you take me." The thing looked back at me, and again I had that unsettling impression of intelligence. It was considering my offer, weighing the pros and cons of different prey. Then it made its choice. The creature rushed me again, but this time I was ready. I dove to my left, rolling across the hard ground and coming up in a shooting stance. The thing overshot me by several feet, its momentum carrying it past where I'd been standing. I put 3 rounds center mass, the muzzle flashes strobing like lightning in the darkness. So, at least one found its mark. I heard the wet slap of bullet meeting flesh, saw the creature stumble and nearly fall, but it recovered faster than anything that size had a right to. It spun toward me with fluid grace, those alien eyes locked onto mine with what looked like personal hatred. Blood now stained its torso in several places, dark patches that glistened in my flashlight beam. But it was still moving, still hunting, still very much a threat. How many rounds did I have left? 7? 6? I'd lost count in the adrenaline rush of combat. The creature began moving in a wide circle around me, just outside the effective range of my flashlight. I tried to track it, but keeping the beam on target while maintaining a proper shooting stance was proving impossible. Every few seconds, it would disappear into absolute darkness, leaving me to guess where it might emerge. "Come on," I muttered, sweat stinging my eyes despite the cold mountain air. "Stop playing games." As if it had understood me, the creature stopped moving. The forest fell silent except for my own ragged breathing and the distant sound of wind through the pines. Even Evelyn's soft whimpering had ceased. I swept my flashlight back and forth across the tree line, searching for those reflective eyes. Nothing. It was like the thing had simply vanished into the night. A branch snapped somewhere to my left. I spun toward the sound, finger tightening on the trigger, but found only empty forest. Another sound came from behind me, the soft whisper of something large moving through undergrowth. I turned again, heart hammering against my ribs. It was playing with me. using the darkness and my own fear to break down my defenses. And it was working. I could feel panic starting to cloud my judgment, making me jump at shadows and waste ammunition on ghost targets. Think, I told myself. Think like a cop, not a victim. The creature was wounded. I was sure of that much. It was bleeding, possibly more hurt than it was letting on. And it was intelligent enough to use tactics, which meant it was also intelligent enough to make mistakes. To make mistakes. I backed toward the trailer, using the structure to protect my rear. If I could get inside, I might be able to barricade the doors and windows, maybe even find a phone that worked. Not much of a plan, but better than standing in the open like a target. I'd made it maybe halfway to the porch when the creature struck again. This time it came from above, dropping from the low roof of the trailer like some nightmare vision of death. I caught a glimpse of it silhouetted against the stars, all claws and teeth and alien grace, before it slammed into me with the force of a falling piano. We went down hard, my flashlight flying away into the darkness. The creature's weight pinned me to the ground, and I could feel its hot breath on my face as it tried to get its teeth into my throat. I managed to get my left forearm up just in time, grunting in pain as powerful jaws clamped down on the thick material of my jacket. My right hand still held my pistol. I jammed the muzzle against the creature's ribs and pulled the trigger repeatedly. The sharp cracks muffled by its massive body. It roared and thrashed, releasing my arm and scrambling backward. I rolled away and staggered to my feet, my left arm hanging useless at my side. The creature had retreated to the edge of my vision, crouched low and breathing heavily. Dark fluid, its blood, dripped steadily from multiple wounds. But I was in even worse shape. My left arm felt like it was on fire, and I could feel warm blood running down my fingers. My service weapon felt impossibly heavy in my right hand, and when I tried to raise it, the sights wavered like leaves in a breeze. The creature was hurt, but I was dying. It seemed to sense my weakness. It began moving forward again, slowly this time, savoring the approach. Those alien eyes never left mine, and I could swear I saw triumph in their depths. I tried to lift my pistol, but my right arm refused to cooperate. The adrenaline that had carried me this far was wearing off, leaving behind waves of pain and exhaustion that made my knees buckle. The creature was 10 feet away now, close enough that I could see the individual teeth in its grotesque maw, count the scars that crisscrossed its dark hide, close enough to smell its rank breath and the copper scent of blood, both its own and mine. 5 feet. It rose up on its hind legs, towering over me like some primordial god of violence. Its claws caught what little starlight filtered through the trees, gleaming like surgical instruments. "Go to hell," I whispered and managed to raise my gun one last time. The shot went wide, the bullet disappearing into the forest without effect. The creature batted the pistol from my hand with casual ease, sending it spinning away into the darkness. This was it. After 3 years of small-town policing, after surviving the academy and patrol training and every nightmare call that came with the badge, I was going to die in a nameless patch of Montana forest, killed by something that wasn't supposed to exist. The creature drew back one massive arm, claws extended. I could see my death reflected in its alien eyes, and then something hit it in the head with the sound of a church bell. Evelyn Hartwell stood behind the staggered creature, holding what looked like a cast-iron skillet in both hands. Her face was set in a mask of pure determination, all traces of her earlier catatonia burned away by fury. "For Derek," she screamed, bringing the heavy pan down again on the creature's skull. The thing spun toward her with a roar of rage, momentarily forgetting about me. That brief distraction was all I needed. I dove for my fallen pistol, my fingers closing around the grip just as the creature backhanded Evelyn across the yard. She flew through the air like a rag doll, hitting the side of the trailer with a sickening thud before crumpling to the ground. The cast-iron skillet rang against the trailer's metal siding and fell silent, but her sacrifice had given me the opening I needed. I rolled onto my back and emptied my remaining rounds into the creature's torso, the rapid fire shots echoing across the mountains like thunder. Blood sprayed from multiple wounds as the heavy bullets found their mark, and the thing staggered backward with a shriek of pain and fury. My slide locked back on an empty chamber. I was out of ammunition, and the creature was still standing. But something had changed. The fight had gone out of it. Blood poured from at least half a dozen wounds, and its breathing came in ragged gasps. For the first time since this nightmare began, it looked like what it was, a dying animal. It took one step toward me then another, but each movement was slower than the last, more labored. Its alien eyes had lost their predatory gleam, replaced by what looked almost like confusion. 10 feet away from me, it stopped. It swayed on its feet for a moment, looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. Then it turned and stumbled toward the forest. I watched it disappear into the trees, leaving a trail of dark blood on the autumn leaves. Part of me wanted to pursue it, to make sure it was really gone, but I could barely stand, let alone chase a wounded monster through dense forest. Instead, I dragged myself over to where Evelyn lay crumpled against the trailer. She was unconscious but breathing, a trickle of blood running from her nose. Her pulse was steady and strong. She'd live. I managed to find my flashlight and check the area around the trailer one more time. No sign of the creature, but the blood trail led clearly into the forest. Whatever the thing was, it was hurt bad. Maybe bad enough to die from its wounds. Maybe. The rest of that night passed in a blur of emergency vehicles and questions I couldn't answer. Someone, a passing motorist, maybe, or a neighbor who'd heard the gunshots, had called 911. State police, EMT, even a fish and wildlife officer who took one look at the scene and went very quiet. They found Derek's body where I'd left it in the forest clearing. The official report listed his death as a bear attack, despite the fact that no bear had ever left wounds like those. Evelyn backed up my story about a wild animal attack, though she conveniently forgot about the creature's more unusual characteristics. The blood trail disappeared after about 100 yards, leading investigators to conclude that I'd wounded, but not killed the animal responsible. A team of hunters spent 3 days combing the forest without finding so much as a hair. Officially, the incident was classified as a wild animal attack. The unusual circumstances were attributed to poor visibility, adrenaline, and the trauma of combat. No one wanted to admit that something unknown was stalking the forests of Montana. Evelyn Hartwell disappeared about a week after her husband's funeral. She sold the trailer to a real estate company and left no forwarding address. I tried to track her down for months afterward, but she'd vanished as completely as if she'd never existed. I stayed with the department for another 2 years, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. Every call into the forest made my palms sweat. Every shadow seemed to hold teeth and claws. I started carrying a backup weapon, then a third gun, then a rifle in my patrol car. Nothing felt like enough. Eventually, I transferred to the city. Became a homicide detective in Great Falls, where the monsters were human and the darkness was electric. I'm good at my job. I understand the evil that people do to each other, the casual cruelty that civilization barely keeps in check. But none of those horrors compare to the memory of that night in the forest. None of them change the fact that somewhere in the vast wilderness of Montana, something is still out there. Furry. Something that defies explanation, that challenges everything we think we know about the natural world. Sometimes late at night when the city is quiet, I find myself wondering if it's still alive, whether it survived its wounds and learned from our encounter. Whether it's more careful now, more cunning in its hunts. And sometimes, when the wind is just right and the shadows fall at the perfect angle, I catch a scent that reminds me of that night. Wild and predatory, and utterly alien. On those nights, I double-check my locks and keep my service weapon close at hand, because I know the truth that the official reports will never acknowledge. There are things in the wilderness that were never meant to coexist with humanity. Iku. Ancient things that have learned to hide from our cameras and satellites, our scientific instruments and rational minds. And sometimes, on quiet October nights in rural Montana, they come calling. I've never spoken publicly about what really happened on Timber Ridge Road. Timber Ridge Road. This is the first time I've put the full story down in writing, and I'll probably never share it with anyone while I'm alive. Who would believe it? Who would want to believe it? But the evidence is there for anyone brave enough to look. Unexplained deaths in the wilderness. Hikers who never come home. Hunters who abandon their camps and refuse to talk about what they saw. The thing that killed Derek Hartwell is still out there. Maybe there are others like it, a whole population of creatures that exist just outside the edges of human knowledge. Maybe they've always been there, sharing the wilderness with us, occasionally crossing paths with hikers or hunters unlucky enough to stumble into their territory. I hope I never find out. But late at night, when sleep won't come, and the memories are too fresh, I sometimes wonder if that creature from Timber Ridge Road remembers me the way I remember it. Whether it carries scars from our encounter, whether it thinks about the human who fought back and lived to tell about it. And whether someday it might decide to finish what we started on that cold October night in 1997. The wilderness is vast, but not infinite, and some things never forget. This happened in 2003 up in the Adirondacks, near a lake that no one goes near anymore. Now, if you're thinking this sounds like the start of some campfire tale, just know I've got no time for that nonsense. My life is pretty ordinary, but I guess I do get a little stir-crazy. Maybe that's why I agreed to a last-minute hiking trip with my friend Alex and my younger cousin Tate. I should have known that nothing good ever comes from these spontaneous adventures. The call came on a Thursday evening in late September. I was sitting in my apartment in Albany, staring at the same four walls I'd been looking at for months when my phone rang. Alex's voice crackled through with that familiar edge of excitement that usually meant trouble. "Carson, you busy this weekend?" he asked, not waiting for an answer. I found something incredible. I knew better than to encourage him, but the restlessness that had been eating at me for weeks made me curious despite myself. What kind of something? A lake. Ravens Hollow? It's about 4 hours north, deep in the mountains. I've been researching it for weeks. His voice dropped to that conspiratorial whisper he used when he thought he was onto something big. "Carson, the locals won't even talk about it. I mean, they literally change the subject when you bring it up." That should have been warning enough. Alex had a history of chasing ghost stories and urban legends, dragging whoever would listen along for the ride. Usually these adventures ended with us hiking through perfectly normal wilderness, while Alex insisted he could feel the paranormal energy. But there was something different in his voice this time, a genuine unease that I'd never heard before. "I already called Tate," he continued. "Kid's all in. Says he needs the adventure before college starts getting serious. My cousin Tate had just turned 19, fresh out of high school and full of that invincible stupidity that comes with youth. He was a good kid, but like most teenagers, he thought the world was one big playground designed for his entertainment. The idea of him and Alex heading into the wilderness together without supervision made my stomach turn. "Alex, you know how I feel about your ghost hunting expeditions. This isn't ghost hunting," he insisted. I don't know what this is." But Carson, I showed the old maps to my buddy at the Geological Survey. He got weird about it. Told me to stay away, wouldn't say why. When's the last time a geologist warned you off a patch of wilderness for non-scientific reasons? I had to admit that was strange. I'd known Alex since college, and while he was prone to conspiracy theories and supernatural obsessions, he wasn't a liar. If someone at the Geological Survey had warned him off, there might be something to it. Besides, Alex added, playing his ace, When's the last time you did anything interesting? You've been in that apartment so long you're practically growing roots. He wasn't wrong. The past few months had been a blur of routine and dissatisfaction. I'd been working the same dead-end job, following the same patterns, feeling like I was slowly disappearing into the background of my own life. The thought of getting out, of breathing real air, and feeling actual dirt under my feet was more appealing than I wanted to admit. "What exactly do you know about this place?" I asked, already feeling myself wavering. "It's old, really old. Native American name, but the local tribes don't claim it. There are stories going back to the 1800s about people disappearing near the lake. Hunters, trappers, even a few families that were never found. The thing is, Carson, it's not just people going missing. It's the way they go missing." "What do you mean?" "I mean, sometimes they find the camps perfectly intact, like people just vanished mid-activity. Other times they find evidence of something else, something that doesn't make sense." I could hear Alex shuffling papers on his end, probably spreading out the research he'd compiled. He was nothing if not thorough when something caught his interest. "Look, I know how this sounds," he said, "but I've been having dreams about this place. The same dream every night for 2 weeks. I see this lake black as oil, surrounded by trees that look like they're leaning in to whisper secrets, and there's something watching from the other side." That gave me pause. Alex was prone to excitement and exaggeration, but he wasn't mystical. He didn't believe in prophetic dreams or supernatural visions. For him to admit to something like that meant it was really getting to him. "I need to go, Carson. I need to see what's there. But I'm not stupid enough to go alone, and I'm not taking Tate without someone sensible along." The flattery was obvious, but it worked. I found myself thinking about the weekend stretching ahead, empty and predictable. I thought about Tate, enthusiastic and unprepared, following Alex into whatever trouble he might find. And despite every rational instinct telling me to stay home, I heard myself saying yes. "Fine, but we do this smart. Good equipment, detailed route plan, and we tell people where we're going." "Already handled," Alex said, and I could hear the grin in his voice. "I'll pick you up Friday night. We'll drive up, camp at the trailhead, and hike in Saturday morning. It's only about 8 miles to the lake." After I hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my apartment, wondering what I'd just agreed to. Outside, Albany hummed with its usual urban noise, but for some reason, it felt more distant than usual, like I was already halfway to wherever Alex wanted to take us. I spent the evening digging through my camping gear, checking and rechecking equipment I hadn't used in months. Everything seemed in order, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was forgetting something important, something that might matter more than I realized. That night, I dreamed of dark water and watching eyes, and woke with the strange certainty that my life was about to change in ways I couldn't possibly understand. Friday evening brought Alex to my door with his usual manic energy and a truck loaded with enough gear for a month-long expedition. Tate sat in the passenger seat, grinning with that infectious enthusiasm that made him impossible to discourage, even when you knew you should try. "Uncle Carson," he called out, using the childhood nickname that made me feel ancient at 32. "This is going to be epic." Alex had spread maps across his dashboard, marked with highlighter and covered in his cramped handwriting. As we drove north, he explained his research with the dedication of a doctoral candidate defending his thesis. "The lake sits in a depression that doesn't match the surrounding geology," he said, consulting his notes while navigating the increasingly narrow mountain roads. "It's almost perfectly circular, about 200 yards across, and the locals claim it's impossibly deep." "No one's ever found the bottom." "Maybe because no one's ever tried very hard," I suggested, but Alex shook his head. "They have tried. State Environmental Survey attempted a depth study in 1987. Their equipment malfunctioned. Every piece of it, all at once. Sonar, depth charges, even simple weighted lines. Nothing worked." Tate leaned forward from the back seat, clearly hooked. "What do you think caused it?" "That's what we're going to find out," Alex said with the confidence of someone who'd never encountered a problem he couldn't solve through persistence and stubbornness. We drove deeper into the mountains as the sun set, the familiar comfort of civilization falling away mile by mile. The radio stations faded to static, then disappeared entirely. Cell phone coverage vanished somewhere around a town called Whitehall, leaving us truly isolated for the first time in recent memory. The roads grew rougher, winding through dense forests that seemed to press closer to the pavement with each passing hour. Ancient pines and maples formed a canopy so thick that even in daylight it would feel like perpetual dusk. Now, with full darkness fallen, our headlights carved a narrow tunnel through walls of black trees. How much further? I asked around 11 o'clock, starting to regret the whole enterprise. About 20 minutes to the trailhead, Alex replied, consulting a GPS unit that showed nothing but green wilderness in all directions. The parking area is just an old logging road, but it'll get us within 8 miles of the lake. Those 20 minutes stretched into 40 as we navigated increasingly primitive roads, some barely wide enough for Alex's truck. Twice we had to stop and move fallen branches, and once Alex had to back up nearly a quarter mile to navigate around a washout that looked recent. So when's the last time anyone actually drove back here? Tate asked, voicing what we were all thinking. According to the Forest Service, this road gets maybe a dozen vehicles a year, Alex admitted. Mostly hunters during deer season, and even then, not many. Finally, we reached what could generously be called a parking area. A small clearing where the road simply ended, surrounded by trees so tall they disappeared into the darkness above. Alex cut the engine, and suddenly we were surrounded by the kind of silence that makes city dwellers uncomfortable. No traffic, no machinery, no human sounds at all. Just the whisper of wind through branches and the distant call of some night bird I couldn't identify. We set up camp quickly and efficiently, 3 experienced outdoorsmen who'd done this enough times to work without much discussion. But there was something off about the process, a tension that had nothing to do with normal pre-adventure nerves. You guys notice how quiet it is? Tate asked as we arranged our sleeping bags around a small fire. He was right. The silence was oppressive, almost unnatural. Even in remote wilderness, you usually hear something. Insects, small animals moving through the underbrush, the rustle of leaves. Here there was nothing but our own breathing and the occasional pop of burning wood. Probably just the altitude, Alex said, but he didn't sound convinced. We're pretty high up here. I checked my altimeter, 3,800 feet. High for the Adirondacks, but not enough to explain the absolute stillness surrounding us. We tried to maintain normal conversation around the fire, sharing plans for the next day and speculating about what we might find at the lake. But the words felt hollow, swallowed by the pressing darkness beyond our small circle of light. More than once, I caught myself straining to hear something, anything, that might break the suffocating quiet. My grandfather used to tell stories about places like this, Tate said around midnight, staring into the flames. Places where the spirits got confused, where they couldn't find their way to whatever comes next. Your grandfather was Cherokee, not local, I pointed out, but Tate shrugged. He said some places collect lost things. Lost spirits, lost people, lost time. Said you could tell these places by the silence. Alex laughed, but it sounded forced. Good thing we're not lost spirits then. Not yet, Tate replied quietly. And something in his tone made us all fall silent. We took turns keeping watch, though none of us articulated why we felt the need. I drew the midnight to 3 shift and spent it feeding the fire and listening to the absolute nothing that surrounded our camp. Twice I was certain I heard footsteps circling us just beyond the firelight, but when I grabbed my flashlight and swept the perimeter, I found only trees and shadows. At one point, around 2:30, the fire suddenly dimmed as if something had passed between it and the oxygen it needed. The flames flickered and danced in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate, like they were responding to some unseen presence. I added more wood and stirred the coals, but the dancing continued for several minutes before finally returning to normal. When Alex relieved me at 3, I was grateful to crawl into my sleeping bag and try to find some rest. But sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of watching eyes and whispered warnings in languages I didn't understand. Dawn brought little relief. The oppressive silence continued, and our breakfast conversation was subdued, as if speaking too loudly might wake something better left sleeping. We broke camp efficiently, shouldering our packs and consulting Alex's maps one final time. 8 miles northeast, he said, pointing toward a gap in the trees that might once have been a trail. Should take us about 4 hours at a steady pace. And if we don't find anything? I asked. Alex grinned, but there was something strained about it. Then we'll have had a nice hike in beautiful country. As we headed into the trees, I looked back once at our campsite. The fire pit was cold and clean, our tire tracks already fading in the soft earth. In a few days, there would be no sign we'd ever been there at all. Somehow, that thought was more unsettling than it should have been. The hike to Raven's Hollow began innocently enough. Alex led us along what might once have been a game trail, winding through dense forest that grew thicker and more oppressive with each mile. The trees here were old, older than anything I'd seen in other parts of the Adirondacks, their trunks massive and gnarled, their branches forming such a tight canopy that even at midday, we walked in perpetual twilight. For the first few hours, we maintained the casual banter typical of a hiking trip. Tate regaled us with stories from his first semester at college. Alex pontificated about various conspiracy theories, and I tried to shake the unease that had been building since we'd arrived at the trailhead. But as we went deeper, our conversation gradually died away. There was something about this forest that discouraged speech, as if the very air was too thick to carry casual words. The silence wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a presence unto itself, pressing against us with almost physical weight. "The trees are wrong," Tate said suddenly, stopping in the middle of what he'd been saying about his economics professor. Alex and I both looked around, trying to see what he meant. At first glance, the forest looked like any other. Pine, maple, oak, the usual northeastern mix. But as I studied it more carefully, I began to understand what Tate had noticed. The trees were leaning. Not dramatically, not in any way that would immediately catch your attention, but subtly, consistently, all in the same direction. As if they were all turning towards something, listening to some call we couldn't hear. Probably just the prevailing wind patterns, Alex said, but his voice lacked conviction. "What wind?" Tate asked. He was right. We hadn't felt so much as a breeze since entering the forest. We pressed on, but now I found myself studying the vegetation more carefully. The deeper we went, the more obvious it became that something was affecting the normal growth patterns. Branches twisted in unnatural spirals, roots emerged from the ground at odd angles, and everywhere there was this subtle sense of vegetation straining towards some distant focal point. Around noon, we stopped for lunch in a small clearing where a massive oak had fallen, creating the first real open space we'd seen in hours. The sudden exposure to actual daylight was both relief and revelation. We were all squinting like cave dwellers, and I realized how thoroughly the forest had isolated us from the normal world. "How much further?" I asked, consulting my own map and GPS. "Maybe 2 miles, Alex replied, but he was frowning at his instruments. "This is weird. My GPS keeps jumping around, says we're here, then half a mile east, then back here again." I checked mine and found the same problem. The readings were unstable, shifting constantly in a way that suggested either equipment failure or some kind of interference. "Magnetic anomaly," Tate suggested. He was majoring in geology and liked to show off his knowledge. "So, maybe," Alex said. But he was studying his compass, which seemed to be spinning slowly, unable to find magnetic north. We finished lunch in uncomfortable silence, each of us dealing with the growing certainty that we were in a place that didn't follow normal rules. The rational part of my mind insisted there had to be scientific explanations for everything we were experiencing, but that voice was getting quieter by the hour. The final approach to Raven's Hollow was the worst part of the hike. The trail, such as it was, began to descend through terrain that felt fundamentally wrong. The slope was too steep, the trees too close together, the ground too soft beneath our feet. More than once, I had the sensation that we were walking on something that wasn't quite solid, as if the earth here was somehow less substantial than it should be. And then, without warning, we emerged from the tree line and saw the lake. Raven's Hollow was exactly as Alex had described it. A perfect circle of black water surrounded by a ring of pines that leaned inward like conspirators sharing secrets. The lake was maybe 200 yards across, its surface so still it looked like polished obsidian. There was no beach, no gradual slope into the water. The forest simply ended at the edge, and the lake began. But what Alex hadn't conveyed, what no description could have prepared us for, was the sense of presence that radiated from the water. This wasn't just a remote mountain lake. This was something alive, something aware, something that had been waiting for us. Jesus, Tate whispered, look at it. We stood at the tree line for several minutes, none of us eager to approach the water's edge. The lake exerted a strange pull, drawing our eyes and holding them, but there was nothing welcoming about the invitation. It felt more like a trap than a destination. The smell, Alex said suddenly, and I realized he was right. There was an odor rising from the water. Subtle but unmistakable. Decay, stagnation, something organic left too long in darkness. Maybe we should just take some pictures and head back, I suggested, but I knew even as I said it that Alex wouldn't be satisfied with that. We came all this way, he said, adjusting his pack and starting toward the water. Might as well get a closer look. Reluctantly, Tate and I followed. Each step toward the lake felt like walking deeper into some kind of field, as if the air itself was growing thicker and more resistant. By the time we reached the edge, I was breathing hard despite the minimal exertion. Up close, the water was even more unsettling. It was perfectly black, so dark that it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When I crouched down and held my hand just above the surface, I couldn't see any depth at all. It was like looking into a pool of liquid night. Alex, I said, I think we should go. But Alex wasn't listening. He was staring across the lake, his face pale and his eyes wide with something that might have been fear or fascination. Do you see it? He asked quietly. I followed his gaze and felt my heart stutter. On the far shore, barely visible through the overhanging branches, was a figure. It stood perfectly motionless, tall and thin, its outline blurry against the backdrop of trees. Is that a person? Tate asked, but even as he spoke, we all knew it wasn't. The figure was wrong in ways that defied immediate analysis. Too tall, with arms that hung past its knees. Its posture was rigid, unnatural, like it was balancing on legs that weren't quite the right length. And though the distance made details impossible to discern, there was something about its stillness that suggested it wasn't alive in any conventional sense. Maybe it's just a dead tree, I said. But I didn't believe it. As if responding to my words, the figure moved. Not walking, not stepping, but shifting position in a single jerky motion, like a piece being moved on a game board. It was now facing directly toward us, and though I couldn't make out its features, I felt the weight of its attention like ice water in my veins. We need to leave, I said, standing up and backing away from the water's edge. Right now. But Alex was transfixed, staring at the figure with the intensity of a man seeing a miracle or a nightmare. It's real, he whispered. It's actually real. The figure raised one impossibly long arm and waved at us. Not a greeting, not a gesture of acknowledgement, but something else entirely. Something that felt like mockery, like a predator playing with prey it knew couldn't escape. That broke the spell. All three of us turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with panic-fueled clumsiness. Behind us, I heard a sound that might have been laughter, low and cold and utterly inhuman. We didn't stop running until we were well into the forest, gasping and stumbling over roots and rocks. When we finally collapsed against a cluster of birch trees, I looked back toward the lake, but the tree line blocked our view. What the hell was that? Tate demanded, his voice shaking. I don't know, Alex admitted. And for the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely scared. But it waved at us. It knew we were there. We're leaving, I said firmly. Now. We pack up and hike back to the truck. But Carson, no. I stood up, my legs still trembling from the adrenaline. Whatever that was, we don't belong here. This place is wrong, and we're getting out before something happens. For once, Alex didn't argue. We started back through the forest, moving faster than was safe on the rough terrain. But behind us carried on air that shouldn't have been moving. I could swear I heard the sound of something following. Something that had learned our scent and had no intention of letting us simply walk away. We hadn't made it half a mile from the lake when we realized we were being followed. It started as a feeling, that primitive awareness that predators are real and you might be prey. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself checking over my shoulder every few steps. Alex had gone quiet, no longer pontificating about paranormal phenomena, and Tate was staying close enough to step on my heels. Then we heard it, the sound of something large moving through the forest behind us, not trying to be quiet, but not exactly making a direct approach either. Branches snapped, leaves rustled, and occasionally there was a wet sliding sound that made my skin crawl. Maybe it's just a bear, Tate suggested, but his voice was tight with fear. Bears don't sound like that, Alex replied, and he was right. Whatever was following us moved wrong, with irregular pauses and sudden bursts of motion that suggested something unnatural about its gait. I stopped and held up my hand, motioning for silence. We all froze, listening intently. For a moment, there was nothing but our own labored breathing. Then, from somewhere behind us and slightly to the left, came a sound that made my blood turn to ice, a low, rhythmic clicking like fingernails tapping against wood. "It's playing with us," Alex whispered, "hurting us." He was right. Every time we tried to veer off our original path, the sounds would shift, cutting off our intended direction and forcing us back onto the trail that led toward our campsite. Whatever was following us wasn't just pursuing, it was directing our movement with the patience of an experienced hunter. We picked up our pace, trying to maintain the balance between speed and stealth. The clicking continued, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always there. And underneath it, barely audible, was something that might have been breathing, if breathing could sound like wind through a crypt. "There," Tate said suddenly, pointing ahead. "The clearing where we had lunch." The fallen oak was exactly as we'd left it, but now the space felt more like a trap than a rest stop. The trees pressed close on all sides, and the patch of sky visible above seemed impossibly small and distant. "Do we stop?" Alex asked. Before I could answer, the clicking stopped. The forest fell into absolute silence, and somehow that was worse than the pursuit. We stood in the center of the clearing, back to back, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. "There," Tate breathed. At the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the shadows between two massive pines, was the figure from the lake. It stood perfectly still, watching us with an intensity that was almost physical. This close, its wrongness was undeniable. It was roughly human-shaped but stretched, as if someone had taken a normal person and pulled them like taffy. Its arms hung down past its knees, ending in what looked like clusters of twigs rather than fingers. And its face was smooth, featureless, like a mannequin that had never been finished. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just pale skin stretched tight over angular bone structure. "Don't move," I whispered, but Tate was already backing away. The figure's head tilted slightly, following Tate's movement with predatory focus. Then it stepped forward, and I saw that it wasn't walking so much as gliding, its feet barely touching the ground as it moved with fluid, impossible grace. "Run," I said quietly. We bolted across the clearing and into the trees on the far side, crashing through underbrush with desperate abandon. Behind us, I heard that wet sliding sound again, closer now, accompanied by a noise like wind chimes made of bone. The thing was fast, impossibly fast. No matter how quickly we moved, it seemed to be keeping pace without effort, sometimes appearing between trees ahead of us, sometimes flanking us from the side. It was driving us, herding us like sheep, and I was beginning to understand that it had a specific destination in mind. "It's not trying to catch us," Alex gasped as we scrambled over a fallen log. "It's leading us somewhere." "Where?" Tate demanded. Before anyone could answer, I stumbled into a spider web and felt the sticky strands cling to my face. But as I wiped them away, I realized they weren't spider webs at all. They were too thick, too strong, and they had an oily quality that made my skin burn where they touched. "Don't touch those," Alex warned, but it was too late. The strands were everywhere now, hanging between trees like some kind of grotesque decoration. And as we pushed deeper into the forest, they grew thicker and more numerous. We're in its territory now, I realized with growing horror. It's been preparing for this. The sticky strands formed an increasingly dense maze, forcing us along a specific path that led deeper into the forest. Every time we tried to deviate, we found ourselves entangled in the viscous web, struggling to break free while that clicking sound grew closer. And then Tate screamed. I spun around to see him caught in a cluster of the oily strands, fighting to pull free as something pale and elongated reached out from behind a tree. The thing's arm stretched impossibly far, its twig-like fingers brushing against Tate's shoulder. "Get away from him!" I shouted, grabbing the largest branch I could find and swinging it at the figure. The branch passed right through it as if it wasn't entirely solid, but somehow, impossibly, those finger twigs made contact with Tate's skin, leaving dark marks that spread like ink stains through fabric. Tate cried out in pain and stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder. Where the thing had touched him, his shirt was disintegrating and underneath, his skin was turning black. Tate! Alex grabbed our cousin's other arm, helping to pull him away from the reaching figure. But the thing wasn't done. It glided closer, its featureless face tilting as if examining its handiwork. Then, impossibly, a slit appeared where its mouth should be, opening wide to reveal darkness that seemed to extend far deeper than any throat should go. The clicking sound was coming from inside it, I realized. The rhythmic tapping of something moving in the depths of its impossible throat. Move, move, move. I pushed Alex and Tate ahead of me, back toward what I hoped was the direction of our camp. We ran blindly through the maze of sticky strands, some part of my mind noting that they seemed to be dissolving now, clearing a path for our escape. The thing was letting us go, but not out of mercy. It was done with us, satisfied with whatever it had accomplished when it touched Tate. By the time we reached our campsite, Tate was barely conscious. The black mark on his shoulder had spread down his arm and across his chest, and his skin felt cold and clammy. Alex helped me get him into the truck while I threw our gear into the back with shaking hands. Hospital, I said, starting the engine. Right now, as we pulled away from the trailhead, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw a pale figure standing at the edge of the trees watching our departure with that eyeless, patient attention. It raised one impossibly long arm in what might have been a farewell wave, or a promise that this wasn't over. The nearest hospital was 2 hours away, and Tate spent most of the drive drifting in and out of delirium. The black mark on his shoulder had stopped spreading, but it pulsed with a rhythm that didn't match his heartbeat, as if something alien was trying to synchronize with his body's natural rhythms. Cold. He kept mumbling. So cold, it's looking for me. Alex and I exchanged worried glances in the front seat. There was no cell phone coverage until we reached the main highway, and even then, how would we explain what had happened? A hiking accident? An animal attack? The truth was too bizarre for anyone to believe. The emergency room staff was professional but baffled. The black mark on Tate's shoulder defied easy categorization. It wasn't a bruise, wasn't frostbite. Wasn't any kind of trauma they could identify. One doctor suggested some kind of chemical burn, but when they tested the affected area, they found no trace of caustic substances. Has he been exposed to any unusual substances? Dr. Martinez asked, studying the mark with obvious confusion. Industrial chemicals, exotic plants, anything like that? We were just hiking, I said, which was true as far as it went. They ran blood tests, took x-rays, even consulted with specialists over the phone. Everything came back normal except for one anomaly. Tate's body temperature kept fluctuating, dropping as low as 94 degrees before slowly climbing back to normal, then dropping again. It's like something is drawing heat out of him, Dr. Martinez explained. But we can't find any cause. For 3 days, Tate lay in that hospital bed, mumbling about cold shadows and reaching hands. The mark slowly faded from black to dark green to a sickly yellow, and his fever broke. On the 4th morning, he woke up lucid and confused, with no memory of the encounter at Raven's Hollow. I remember hiking to some lake, he said when we visited. But after that, nothing. Did I fall? Hit my head? Alex and I agreed to stick to the story we'd told the hospital staff. Tate had slipped near the water and hit his shoulder on a rock. It was easier than trying to explain what had really happened, and it spared Tate the knowledge of what he'd endured. But privately, Alex and I began to research everything we could find about Raven's Hollow and the surrounding area. What we discovered was disturbing enough to make us both lose sleep. The disappearances went back further than Alex had initially discovered. Much further. Records from the early 1800s described hunters and trappers who vanished near the black water that reflects no light. Native American oral histories, recorded by early ethnographers, spoke of a place where the hungry shadow waited for those foolish enough to venture too close. More recently, we found newspaper clippings from the 1950s describing a search and rescue operation for a family of 4 who had disappeared while camping in the area. They were found 3 days later, alive but changed. The father spent the rest of his life in a psychiatric facility, babbling about the thing with reaching arms. The mother and children recovered physically but reportedly never spoke of their experience, even to each other. In 1987, the state environmental survey that Alex had mentioned hadn't just experienced equipment failures. According to a report buried in bureaucratic archives, 3 of the 5 survey team members had suffered what were described as psychological episodes, requiring immediate evacuation and extended psychiatric care. "There's a pattern," Alex said one evening as we pored over our research in my apartment. "People encounter this thing, survive, but come back different. Damaged. What about the ones who don't come back?" Alex pulled out a folder thick with missing person reports. 17 confirmed disappearances in the last 50 years, all within a 5-mile radius of the lake. No bodies ever found. The most unsettling discovery came from a geological survey conducted in the 1970s. According to the report, Ravens Hollow wasn't a natural lake at all. The depression had been formed by some kind of sudden collapse, creating a perfect circle that extended down at least 400 feet before the survey equipment stopped functioning. "It's like something fell from the sky," Alex said, studying the topographical maps. "Or something emerged from underground. Either way, that lake shouldn't exist." I was about to respond when my phone rang. It was the hospital. "Mr. Tall Elk, this is Dr. Martinez. I'm calling about your cousin. You need to come down here right away." We found Tate standing in his hospital room, fully dressed, staring out the window toward the north. His bags were packed, and he had the focused intensity of someone preparing for a journey. "I have to go back," he said without turning around. "Tate, you just got out of bed. You're still recovering." "No," he said quietly. "I'm not recovering. I'm changing, and it's calling me back." Dr. Martinez pulled us aside. "His vitals are normal, but there's something else. The mark on his shoulder, it's active again." "Not visible, but we can detect increased electrical activity in the tissue. It's almost like there's some kind of transmitter under his skin." "Transmitter for what?" "We don't know, but whatever it is, it's getting stronger." That night, Tate walked out of the hospital. Despite security cameras and locked doors, he simply vanished. The footage showed him in his room at midnight, and then the next frame showed an empty bed. No one saw him leave. We found him 3 days later, sitting by the edge of Ravens Hollow, staring into the black water with an expression of peaceful contentment. He looked healthy, normal, except for his eyes. His eyes held the same dark depth as the lake itself. "I've been waiting for you," he said when he saw us approaching. "Tate, come on, let's go home." He smiled, but it wasn't quite his smile. "This is home now. It showed me what I really am, what I was always meant to be." The cold isn't something to fight anymore, Carson. It's something to embrace. He stood up and walked toward the water, and despite our shouts and attempts to restrain him, he simply faded away like morning mist, leaving us alone on the shore of that impossible lake. That was 20 years ago. It was 20 years ago. Alex moved to Colorado and refuses to talk about what happened. "I stayed in Albany, but I've never gone hiking again." Sometimes on cold nights when the wind is still, I get phone calls with no one on the other end. Just breathing, slow and patient, like something waiting for me to finally understand. Last month, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a photograph of Ravens Hollow, taken from the same spot where we first saw the figure. But now there were 2 shapes standing in the shadows across the water, one tall and wrong, reaching toward the camera with those impossible arms. The other was unmistakably Tate, though he looked exactly as he had 20 years ago. He was waving just as the thing had waved at us on that first day. And on the back of the photograph, written in handwriting I recognized, were 4 words. "Come home soon, Carson." I keep the photograph in my desk drawer, and sometimes I find myself studying it for hours, feeling that familiar pull toward the dark water and whatever waits beneath its surface. Part of me knows I should burn it, should forget everything that happened at Ravens Hollow. But another part of me, a part that grows stronger every day, whispers that Tate is right, that the cold isn't something to fight. That maybe it's time to go home.